Gina reclined quietly in her living room, the dim evening light filtering through the curtains. Her hands rested protectively over her rounded belly, feeling the occasional flutter of life within. On the soft rug nearby, her youngest daughter Mia was deeply engrossed in arranging her collection of toy animals, their plastic figures scattered in a parade of imaginative chaos. The gentle hum of cartoons from the TV created a soothing background, a rare moment of calm in their usually bustling household. Stephen walked in from the kitchen, balancing a tray of sliced fruit and a tall glass of water. His face was warm with affection as he set the tray down on the coffee table. "You've got to keep your energy up," he said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Gina offered him a tired but grateful smile. This was her 5th pregnancy, and though her body had grown accustomed to the demands of motherhood, her heart carried a deeper weight this time. With 4 children already filling their home with love and chaos, preparing to welcome another baby was equal parts joy and trepidation. The nursery was ready. Gina and Stephen had spent weeks folding tiny clothes, arranging pastel-colored blankets, and painting the walls a soft lavender. They'd decided on the name Linda, a name that felt timeless and full of hope. It wasn't just a name to them, it was a promise of love and a future waiting to unfold. Everything seemed perfect, and Gina's heart swelled at the thought of holding her baby girl soon. But fate has a cruel way of rewriting plans. Late that night, Gina awoke with a start. A sharp, stabbing pain ripped through her abdomen, different from the aches she'd grown used to over the months. Her breath caught as panic surged. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m., and nudged Stephen awake, her trembling hand pressing against his shoulder. "Stephen," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong." Stephen jolted awake, alarm flashing in his eyes as he turned to her. "What is it? Are you okay?" Gina shook her head, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. "It's not normal," she gasped, clutching her stomach as the pain intensified. "We need to go to the hospital, now." Without hesitation, Stephen threw on his jacket and grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago. The quiet house suddenly seemed to buzz with tension as Gina struggled to her feet. Her legs felt weak beneath her, every step a battle. At the top of the stairs, their 4 children peeked out, their sleepy faces filled with concern. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Elijah, her eldest son, asked, clutching the railing. Gina forced a smile though her pain was mounting. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy just needs to see the doctor. Go back to bed, okay?" Her voice wavered, but she didn't want them to see her fear. The drive to the hospital was agonizing. Rain lashed against the windshield, the rhythmic swish of the wipers barely masking Gina's labored breathing. Stephen's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his silent prayers echoing Gina's whispered pleas. "Please, God, not now, keep her safe." When they finally arrived, the sterile lights of the emergency room seemed blinding. Nurses hurried toward them with a wheelchair, their faces calm but their movements urgent. Gina was rushed into the maternity ward, her chart quickly reviewed. "How far along?" one nurse asked, glancing at Stephen. 27 weeks. He replied, his voice tight with fear. The nurse's lips pressed into a thin line as she nodded. "We'll take care of her," she assured, though the worry in her eyes betrayed her tone. Gina was wheeled into the delivery room, the beeping of monitors and the sterile smell of antiseptic overwhelming her senses. The pain was relentless, each wave threatening to pull her under. "She's in preterm labor," one doctor said, his voice clipped and efficient. "Prepare for an emergency delivery." The words hit Gina like a physical blow. Tears streamed down her face as nurses and doctors moved in a blur around her. Stephen gripped her hand tightly, his own fear etched across his face. "Breathe, Gina, stay with me," one nurse urged, her voice firm but kind. "I can't," Gina sobbed, her strength waning. "You can," the nurse insisted, guiding her through the pain. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Gina pushed with everything she had, her body trembling from the effort, and then, finally, it was over. But the room was silent. No cries, no comforting wail of a newborn taking their first breath. "Why can't I hear her?" Gina's voice cracked, panic flooding her chest. "Why isn't she crying?" The tiny infant was whisked away to a warming table, a nurse rubbing her delicate chest in rhythmic motions. "Come on, baby girl," the nurse murmured, her voice a mix of hope and urgency. "Breathe for me." Gina's vision blurred with tears as she searched the room for answers. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Is she okay? Tell me she's okay." No one answered. The room was a flurry of motion and muted whispers. Stephen held her hand, his grip trembling. His usually steady demeanor cracked under the weight of helplessness. And still the minutes ticked by, each one an agonizing eternity. The neonatal specialist entered the room, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. His movements were methodical, each action deliberate yet heavy with unspoken gravity. He pressed the stethoscope against Linda's tiny, fragile chest, pausing to listen for any sign of life. The room held its collective breath, every second stretching into eternity. "No pulse, no respiratory effort," the specialist said flatly, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then added, "Time of death, 3:22 a.m. Gina's world fractured in an instant. She shook her head violently, tears cascading down her cheeks. Her voice broke into a scream, raw and piercing. "No! No! Check again!" she pleaded, her words trembling with desperation. "She's not gone! She can't be gone!" Her body convulsed with sobs, the kind of grief that consumes and leaves nothing untouched. Stephen stood beside her, his own tears slipping silently down his face. He wrapped his arms around her trembling frame, his strength the only thing holding her together as she unraveled. A nurse approached cautiously, her face weighed down by sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she murmured gently, her voice a soft echo in the devastating quiet. The nurses carefully wrapped Linda's delicate body in a soft white cloth, her tiny face barely visible beneath the folds. They placed her in a small wooden box, its presence a cruel reminder of the life that had barely begun. "You can hold her, if you'd like," the nurse offered, her words tender but heavy. Gina shook her head, her lips trembling. She couldn't do it. She couldn't bear the thought of holding Linda like this. So still, so silent. A clipboard appeared before them, the paperwork stark and clinical. Stephen took the pen with trembling hands, his name scrawled on the line beneath the words he couldn't bear to read aloud, "Death Certificate." The name Linda Harris stared back at him in bold, merciless print. Born April 7, 2019. Time of death, 3:22 a.m. Cause, prematurity. Gina stared at the paper, her mind unable to comprehend the finality of it all. "How is she gone?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She was just here. I carried her. I felt her." Her words dissolved into quiet sobs, her body slumping into the hospital bed. Stephen knelt before her, his face etched with pain. "I'm so sorry, Gina," he whispered, his voice breaking. He took her trembling hands in his own. "I'm so sorry." Gina buried her face in his chest, their grief merging into a single heartbreaking silence. Hours passed in a blur. The sun rose outside the hospital window, but its light brought no warmth to the room. Gina sat motionless, her hollow gaze fixed on nothing, the weight of her loss suffocating. And then, out of the numb haze, something stirred within her, a feeling she couldn't explain, a pull that refused to be ignored. "I need to see her," Gina said suddenly, her voice hoarse but resolute. Stephen blinked, startled. "What?" "I need to see her," she repeated, her tone stronger now. "I need to see my baby. I have to see her one more time." Her eyes met his, and in them Stephen saw a glimmer of the strength she had always carried. Stephen hesitated but nodded slowly. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Okay, let's go see her." A nurse held Gina into a wheelchair. Her legs wobbled beneath her, still weak from labor, but her resolve held her steady. Stephen walked beside her, his footsteps heavy and slow, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The hallway leading to the morgue was long and sterile, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold, harsh glow on the white-tiled floor. The squeak of the wheelchair wheels echoed unnervingly, mingling with the nurse's steady footsteps. The distant beeping of hospital monitors far down the hall seemed to mock the deafening silence that surrounded them. Each turn of the wheel seemed to stretch time further. Gina clutched the thin hospital gown she wore, her knuckles white, her breath shallow, her heart thudded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of the life that no longer beat within her child. Stephen walked in silence beside her, his head bowed. He glanced at Gina every so often, but her expression remained fixed, her gaze locked straight ahead. There was nothing to say. No words could ease the pain or prepare them for what waited at the end of this cold, sterile corridor. With every step closer to the morgue, Gina felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wasn't just walking toward her daughter's lifeless body, She was walking into a reality she wasn't ready to face, but something deep inside urged her forward, a quiet, unrelenting pull she couldn't ignore. They reached the door, and the nurse hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. What waited for them inside would change their lives forever. Her brother Malcolm was waiting by the morgue's door, his tall frame leaning against the wall. His face was tight with pain, his bloodshot eyes betraying hours of tears. The sleeves of his hoodie were damp, either from wiping his face or the sweat of grief that clung to him. As he spotted Gina and Stephen approaching, Malcolm straightened, his back stiffening as though trying to summon strength he didn't have. He wiped at his face one last time, forcing himself to look composed for his sister. "You sure you're ready for this?" Malcolm asked, his voice low and trembling, the weight of the question sinking into the cold air around them. His eyes searched Gina's face, lingering on her haunted expression. Gina nodded slowly, though her movements lacked conviction. Her gaze was fixed on the heavy steel door in front of her, the door that separated her from her daughter. "Yeah," she whispered, the word barely audible like a leaf caught in the wind. "I'm ready." But she wasn't. How could anyone be ready for this? Behind that door was her little Linda, cold and still, wrapped in fabric that felt more final than any goodbye. Her heart screamed that it wasn't true, that her daughter didn't belong here, but reality pressed down on her like a suffocating weight. The nurse swiped her badge against the scanner. A soft beep echoed, followed by a metallic click. The heavy door slid open with a low groan, and a rush of cold air met them, biting at their skin. The sterile smell of steel and antiseptic mixed faintly with something floral and sickly sweet, like wilting flowers left too long in water. The scent churned Gina's stomach, threatening to undo what fragile composure she had. As they rolled inside, the morgue's stark, unfeeling interior seemed to swallow them whole. Rows of polished silver drawers lined the walls, each one large enough to hold a person. The sight of them turned Gina's knees weak, her chest tightening as her eyes darted from one drawer to the next. Her breath hitched, shallow and uneven, as the enormity of the moment crashed over her. She clung to the wheelchair's arms, her knuckles white against the cold steel. This place felt wrong, a cruel and uninviting space where no one, least of all her tiny daughter, should be. Her mind screamed in protest. "She doesn't belong here. None of us do." The nurse stopped at a drawer near the bottom, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She glanced at Gina and Stephen, her expression clouded with sympathy. "Here," the nurse said softly. Her tone was gentle but firm, her professionalism laced with kindness. "Would you like me to open it, or would you prefer to do it yourself?" Stephen hesitated, his lips parting as though to respond, but no words came out. His eyes flickered to Gina, uncertain and searching for her lead. Gina's hands trembled, but she didn't falter. "I'll do it," she said firmly, though her voice quavered. She gripped the arms of the wheelchair for strength, steadying herself as she leaned forward. The nurse stepped aside, giving her room. Gina's fingers hovered over the cold handle of the drawer. The metal was frigid, sending a shiver up her spine as she wrapped her hand around it. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating in her ears. With a deep, shaky breath, she pulled the drawer open. A soft metallic hum filled the room as the drawers slid out, revealing a small, simple wooden box nestled inside. The sight of it stole the air from her lungs. The box was so small, so heartbreakingly small, it seemed impossible that it could hold something so precious. Gina's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. Her fingers brushed over the smooth wood, trembling as she absorbed the weight of what lay before her. "Go ahead, sis," Malcolm said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. "We're right here with you." Gina glanced back at her brother, locking eyes with him for a moment. His face mirrored her grief, his tears flowing freely now. That shared pain gave her the strength to turn back to the box. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was white fabric, neatly wrapped around a tiny, still form. Her breath hitched, and her heart clenched so tightly it felt like it might stop. Slowly she reached forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the cloth. She peeled it back with delicate care, revealing a face so small, so serene it seemed almost unreal. Linda. Her daughter's cheeks were soft and round, her tiny lips slightly parted as though she were mid-sentence in a dream. Long, delicate eyelashes rested gently against her smooth brown skin, framing a face so peaceful it hurt to look at. She looked like she was only sleeping, as if she might wake at any moment. "She looks like she's sleeping," Gina whispered. her voice breaking on the last word. Tears streamed down her face, unstoppable. "My baby. My sweet baby girl." Her voice cracked into a sob as she reached out, her fingers trembling as they caressed Linda's cheek. The skin was cold, colder than she expected, and the chill sent a shock through her heart. Gina's sobs racked her body as she pressed her forehead to the edge of the drawer, her grief pouring out in waves. Stephen knelt beside her, his arms wrapping tightly around her shoulders. He didn't speak, there were no words for this kind of pain, but his presence grounded her as she fell apart. Malcolm placed a hand gently on her back, his head bowed as silent tears streaked his face. Together they formed a circle of shared sorrow, their collective grief spilling into the quiet, sterile morgue. Time lost its meaning as they remained there, mourning a life so brief yet so profoundly cherished. Ari and Breeze's dark-colored suits faded to the background, with no eerie light, none of the tall archways illuminated by the lamp's pharaoh-starred morning. Linda had been gone for hours, but in that moment, surrounded by love and loss, she felt closer than ever. Gina lifted her head, her eyes swollen and red from hours of crying. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps as she tried to steady herself. Slowly, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her hospital gown, her trembling hand brushing over Linda's tiny, delicate fingers. I just need a picture," she said softly. Her voice carried a weight of desperation. Her words carried a weight of desperation, as though this one act could preserve what little she had left of her daughter. Stephen hesitated, his brow furrowing with uncertainty. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice gentle but strained. Gina nodded, her resolve evident even through her grief. "I'm sure," she replied, her tone shaky but insistent. I have to remember her." With trembling fingers she pulled her phone from the pocket of her hospital gown. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as though the device might shatter under the weight of her emotions. She opened the camera app, her hands unsteady as she lined up the shot. The soft click of the camera echoed in the silent morgue, capturing Linda's tiny, peaceful face. Gina took another photo, then another, each image feeling like a fragment of her broken heart that she could hold onto forever. As she lowered the phone, her eyes lingered on Linda, her fingers brushed the soft white cloth, ready to pull it gently back over her daughter's face, when a faint sound broke through the stillness. It was so soft, so fleeting, that she almost missed it. Her breath hitched, her entire body freezing as she strained to listen. Then she heard it again. A sound, a soft, weak cry. Her heart stuttered, then began to pound violently in her chest. Her wide, tear-filled eyes darted to Linda's face, her breath caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." Gina leaned closer, her heart racing as she watched Linda's tiny chest rise ever so slightly, just enough to be noticeable. Her daughter's eyes flickered, her lips parting with another shallow breath. Gina's hand flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her as her knees nearly buckled. "She's alive," Gina choked out, her voice breaking into hysterical cries. "Stephen, Malcolm, she's breathing, look at her, she's breathing." Stephen's eyes widened, his face frozen in shock. Malcolm took a step forward, his mouth agape as he stared at Linda's fragile form. For a moment the three of them stood in stunned silence, unable to process the impossible. Then Malcolm snapped out of his daze. "Move!" he barked, his voice filled with urgency. "We've got to get her to the NICU, now!" Without hesitation, Malcolm leaned into the drawer and carefully lifted Linda's tiny body, cradling her as though she were made of glass. He glanced down, his voice catching in his throat. "She's breathing," he said, the words filled with raw emotion. "She's really breathing." "Run!" Gina screamed, her weak legs propelling her forward as adrenaline overtook her exhaustion. "Go, take her now!" Stephen bolted toward the door, his movements frantic, while Malcolm followed close behind, holding Linda against his chest. Her tiny body rose and fell in fragile, shallow breaths. The nurse at the door sprang into action, slamming her hand against the emergency button on the wall. Alarms blared through the hospital halls, their piercing sound cutting through the chaos. "Code Blue NICU, immediate assistance required," the nurse's voice boomed through the intercom. The family ran as if their lives depended on it, each step a race against time. Gina stumbled after them, her body protesting with every movement, but her focus never wavered. "Hold on, baby girl," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy's right here. Don't stop breathing. Please, don't stop." The NICU doors burst open, the sterile air flooding into the hallway. A nurse hurried toward them, her face a mixture of confusion and shock. "What happened?" she demanded. "Is that a baby? Is she breathing?" "She's alive," Malcolm shouted, his voice cracking. "She's breathing. Get the doctors, now." The nurse didn't waste another second. She waved them forward, her hand slamming against the emergency button again. Within moments, doctors and nurses flooded the room, their movements quick and efficient. Hands reached for Linda, and Malcolm reluctantly released her to the nearest nurse, his face twisted in fear and desperation. "Be careful with her," he barked. "She's fragile." Linda's small body was transferred onto a tiny bed, wires and monitors quickly attached as the medical team worked with precision. The room buzzed with activity, but for Gina, the world seemed to slow. She leaned against the doorway, her legs trembling beneath her, her heart balanced precariously between hope and despair. "Hold on, baby," Gina whispered again, her voice cracking. "You've made it this far. Please, don't give up now." The nurse nodded briskly, gently laying Linda on the small heated table. The bright overhead lights bathed her tiny, fragile body, illuminating every delicate feature. The soft brown tone of her skin, the faint twitch of her minuscule fingers, and the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. Gina stood frozen, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her gown. She couldn't take her eyes off her daughter. "Heart rate is low but steady," one of the nurses said, her tone clipped, her eyes never leaving the monitor. "She's breathing on her own, but it's shallow." Another nurse stepped forward, carefully fitting a small oxygen mask over Linda's face. Her movements were gentle, almost reverent, as though any wrong touch could shatter the fragile hope that now filled the room. Gina's heart clenched at the sight, her pulse quickening with every word the medical staff exchanged. The door swung open and a doctor swept into the room, his white coat flaring behind him like a cape. His face was sharp, focused, and utterly unreadable. "What's the situation?" he demanded, his tone brisk. One of the nurses rattled off Linda's vitals, her voice steady despite the chaos in the room. "She's 27 weeks, born earlier tonight. Declared deceased at 3:22 a.m. Parents say she was in the morgue for over 12 hours. The doctor's eyes snapped to Gina, disbelief clear in his expression. 12 hours? He asked, his voice tinged with shock. She was in cold storage for 12 hours? Gina could barely nod, her tears blurring her vision. "She was so cold," she whispered, her voice trembling. But then she cried. She opened her eyes and cried. Her knees buckled and Stephen caught her just in time, wrapping his arms around her trembling form. "I heard her," Gina sobbed into his chest, her voice raw with emotion. "I'm not crazy, Stephen. I heard her cry." The doctor crouched down to meet her eye level, his expression softening. "You're not crazy," he said quietly, his voice steady, but tinged with something Gina couldn't quite place. Disbelief? Awe? Maybe even fear. Sometimes things happen that we can't explain. But I promise you this, we're going to do everything we can to help her now. He stood abruptly, his face hardening with determination as he barked out orders to the nurses. "Warm IV fluids. Get a respiratory specialist in here immediately. I want a full workup, neurological, cardiac, everything." Gina watched, her breath catching in her throat as the team worked around her daughter. Her eyes never left Linda's tiny face, so delicate yet so alive. Hope began to stir within her chest, but it was fragile, like a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark lake. She didn't dare let herself believe too much. "She's gonna make it, right?" Gina asked, her voice barely audible, her question more a plea than a demand. She turned her wide, tear-filled eyes to the doctor. "Please, tell me she's gonna make it?" The doctor hesitated, his gaze flickering between the monitors and Linda's fragile form. "She's got a long road ahead," he said carefully, his voice measured. "But she's a fighter. I can see that already." Well, the minutes dragged on like hours. Every beep of the heart monitor made Gina flinch, her eyes darting to the screen with each sound. Stephen held her hand tightly, his grip steadying her, though his own eyes were locked on their daughter, silently pleading for a miracle. Malcolm paced the room, his hands rubbing together nervously, his movements restless, as though he could ward off the cold fear gnawing at him. Then a nurse's voice rang out, sharp and panicked. "Her oxygen levels are dropping." The doctor spun around, his eyes snapping to the monitor. The numbers were plummeting. 85, 72, 60. "She's crashing," another nurse cried out, her voice trembling. "Her heart rate is dropping." "Prepare for resuscitation," the doctor ordered, his voice firm, cutting through the rising tension. "Charge the defibrillator to 30 joules. No, 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 Gina wailed, shaking her head violently. Her voice cracked as she sobbed uncontrollably. Not again, please God, not again. She clutched Stephen's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He knelt beside her, his own tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "Stay strong, Gina, stay strong." The doctor's voice rang out like thunder, clear. The paddles pressed against Linda's tiny chest, and her fragile body jolted from the electric shock. Silence, nothing but the steady beeping of the monitors. No movement. No response, the nurse said, her voice heavy with dread. "Charging again," the doctor shouted, his tone desperate but controlled. "Don't give up on her," Gina screamed, her voice raw and piercing, echoing through the room. "Don't you dare give up on my baby." The paddles came down again. Linda's small body arched once more, and then a sound, a beep, then another, and another. The nurse gasped. "We've got a pulse," she cried, her voice breaking with relief. Gina collapsed into Stephen's arms, her sobs uncontrollable. "Thank you, God," she whispered through her tears. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Stephen held her close, his tears soaking into her hair. "She's still with us," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "She's still with us." Malcolm rubbed his face roughly, his hand trembling as he sniffled, struggling to hold himself together. He paced near the wall, his eyes darting between the monitors and the tiny incubator where Linda now lay. Nurse Danielle approached, her gentle eyes resting on Gina with quiet admiration. "Your little girl's a fighter," she said softly, glancing at Linda. "Just like her mama." Gina blinked back tears, her hand pressed lightly against the plastic barrier of the incubator. "She really is," Gina whispered, her voice breaking. Her fingers traced soft circles on the smooth surface, as though the motion might reach Linda and reassure her that her mother was near. Hours had passed since the chaotic race to save Linda, but the intensity of the moment lingered. Inside the clear incubator, Linda's tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Her soft brown skin had regained warmth, a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless hue it had held before. Her fragile hands twitched occasionally, as though reaching for something unseen. Each movement, no matter how small, felt like a miracle. "You did good, baby girl," Gina murmured, her voice carrying quiet determination. "You did real good." Behind her, Stephen and Malcolm sat on the stiff hospital chairs, their exhaustion evident in the heavy droop of their shoulders and the dark circles under their eyes. Neither could take their eyes off Linda. They were drawn to her, as though watching her breathe could somehow ease the weight in their hearts. A nurse approached Gina, clipboard in hand, her expression calm but serious. "We're going to run a full panel of tests," she explained, glancing at Linda. "Her time in the morgue. We need to make sure everything's functioning as it should. Her brain, her lungs, her heart. It's all routine, but it's necessary." Gina nodded quickly, her focus unwavering. "Do whatever you need to do," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Just take care of her, please." Nurse Danielle placed a gentle hand on Gina's shoulder. "We will," she assured her. "She's in good hands now." Gina took a deep breath, the nurse's words sinking in. Safe. For now, she's safe. It was enough for the moment. She leaned forward again, her eyes never leaving Linda. Stephen appeared beside her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He looked haggard. His hoodie hung off his frame like a heavy weight, and the fatigue in his face was impossible to ignore. Without a word, he handed her one of the cups and sank into the chair beside her. The silence between them was thick, filled with exhaustion, fear, and fragile hope. Gina took a small sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding her in reality. She had to stay alert. Linda needed her now more than ever. "You need rest," Stephen said gently, his voice breaking the silence. "You've been up all night. Gina, you just had a baby, you're still healing. You can't push yourself like this." Gina shook her head, her eyes fixed on Linda. "I'm not leaving her," she said firmly, her voice low but steady. "Not again." Her fingers pressed harder against the glass, her face close enough to fog it with her breath. "I wasn't there when she was born," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "I didn't see her first breath. I wasn't awake when they took her away from me. I'm not leaving her now. She's been through too much alone." Her voice cracked, and she bit her lip to hold back the sob threatening to escape. "I won't let her be alone again." Stephen leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he exhaled slowly. "I get it," he said softly, his voice heavy with empathy. "I do. But you need to be strong for her, Gina. If you fall apart now, who's going to be there for her? You've got to take care of yourself too. I can't take care of anything if I'm not recovered myself." His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Gina knew he was right, but logic couldn't compete with the raw fear of losing Linda again. She'd already come too close once. Nurse Danielle returned, glancing at Linda's vitals on the monitor and nodding to herself. She smiled warmly at Gina and Stephen, though the seriousness in her eyes couldn't be masked. "She's stable for now," Danielle said softly, her tone soothing. "Her vitals are holding steady. That's a really good sign." She hesitated, her smile faltering just slightly. "But we need to prepare for a long recovery. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and she's going to need both of you to be strong for her." Gina nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Whatever she needs," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "We're not going anywhere." "She's stable for now," Nurse Danielle said, her voice calm and professional. "Her oxygen levels are good and her heart rate is steady. That's a good sign." Gina sat up straighter in her chair, her hand still resting against the plastic shell of Linda's incubator. The news lifted her heart, though only slightly. "Stable is good," she whispered, her voice more for herself than anyone else. "Stable is good." But deep down she couldn't fully relax. She knew how fragile stable could be, how easily it could vanish. One wrong moment, one shift in the monitors, and everything could come crashing down. "What's next?" Gina asked, turning her wide, exhausted eyes toward Nurse Danielle. "What happens now?" Danielle's face softened, but her eyes carried a seriousness that made Gina's chest tighten. "We'll be running a full neurological assessment," she explained. "Her time in the morgue? It's a concern. We need to make sure her brain activity is normal and that there aren't any signs of oxygen deprivation. We'll also be doing imaging on her lungs to assess any potential damage. It's going to be a long process." She hesitated, then added gently, "Gina, I just want to prepare you for that." Gina swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper. She hated the phrase "prepare yourself." It always felt like a warning for the worst. Still she nodded, forcing her voice to sound steadier than she felt. "Do whatever you have to do," she said, her gaze flickering back to Linda. Just keep her alive." Better. Danielle gave Gina's shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping away, leaving Gina and Stephen alone again. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Hours passed, like days. Every sound from the monitors felt like a warning. Every nurse walking through the door made Gina's breath hitch, fearing they were bringing bad news. Later in the afternoon, Malcolm arrived, carrying bags of food and snacks from a nearby convenience store. He set them on the small table near the chairs, giving Gina and Stephen a quick nod before settling into a chair beside Stephen. The two men didn't talk much, their silence a quiet show of solidarity. Malcolm's presence, though unspoken, was grounding for Gina. It reminded her she wasn't alone in this storm. Stephen eventually stepped out to take a phone call, leaving Malcolm and Gina with Linda. Malcolm leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on his niece's tiny body inside the incubator. "She's strong," he said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "Look at her, Gina. She's fighting. She's got your strength. You're a fighter and now she's a fighter too." Gina turned to him, her lips trembling as tears filled her eyes. His words struck a chord deep within her. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," she said, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and pain. "She's a fighter." Then, suddenly, the heart monitor let out a sharp, rapid beeping sound. Gina's breath caught in her throat and her heart stopped. She shot up from her chair, her eyes glued to the screen. The numbers flashed in red, heart rate dropping, oxygen saturation falling. "No!" Gina gasped, her voice trembling with terror. "No, no, no, no!" The nurses rushed into the room, their movements swift and practiced. One of them spoke quickly, her voice calm but urgent. "She's experiencing respiratory distress. We need to intubate. Call respiratory." Gina's legs buckled beneath her, but Malcolm caught her before she hit the floor. Her wide, tear-filled eyes stayed locked on Linda as the nurses surrounded her, working with a precision that was both terrifying and hopeful. "Please," Gina sobbed, clutching Malcolm's hoodie like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth. "Please, don't take her from me again." Her voice cracked, raw and broken. The suffocating pain she had felt in the morgue came rushing back with full force. Malcolm tightened his grip on her, his voice low and steady. "She's strong, Gina," he said firmly, though his own voice wavered with emotion. "You said it yourself. She's strong. She didn't give up before, and she's not giving up now. "Clear the airway," one of the nurses shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. They tilted Linda's head and inserted a breathing tube. The sound of the ventilator changed, the whoosh of air now louder and more forceful. Gina watched helplessly as the nurses and doctors worked around her tiny baby girl, their hands moving in perfect synchronization. Every second stretched endlessly. Time felt frozen. Everyone in the room held their breath, their eyes locked on Linda's fragile body. Then, it happened. Linda's chest rose, then fell, then rose again. The heart monitor's rapid beeping slowed, turning into a steady rhythmic tone. "She's stabilizing," a nurse called out, relief flooding her voice. "Her heart rate and oxygen levels are back to normal." Gina's legs gave out completely and she collapsed onto her knees. This time, her sobs weren't from pain, they were from pure, overwhelming relief. "Thank you, God," she whispered through her tears, her voice trembling. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Stephen ran back into the room, his phone still in his hand. He froze at the sight of Gina on the floor, his eyes darting to Linda. When he saw her chest rising and falling steadily, his breath hitched. He dropped to his knees beside Gina, wrapping his arms around her tightly. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their baby was still here. She was still fighting. Gina wiped her tear-streaked face, her breath still uneven as she steadied herself. Rising slowly, she pressed her hands against the incubator's clear glass, leaning closer to her daughter. Her voice, shaky but resolute, broke the heavy silence. "You hear me, baby girl?" she whispered, her words full of tender determination. "You're a fighter, Linda. You hear me? You keep fighting, baby. Mommy's right here." Her fingers traced the outline of Linda's delicate face on the other side of the glass. Linda's eyes remained closed, her breathing steady but slow, assisted by the machines that hummed softly in the background. Gina's voice grew a little stronger. "You keep fighting, baby girl, because I'm not going anywhere. I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." No. The ventilator's rhythmic hum filled the air, a constant reminder of how precarious life could be. Gina stayed rooted in the chair she hadn't left for days, her fingers lightly pressed against the plastic as though her touch alone could protect Linda. Her gaze stayed fixed on her tiny daughter, her heart clenching tighter with every beep of the monitor. The fear lingered, a shadow that wouldn't leave no matter how often she whispered to herself, "Breathe, stay calm, she's still here." Stephen sat beside her, his head tilted back and eyes closed, but Gina knew he wasn't asleep. His face was lined with exhaustion, his brows furrowed as if he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. His hoodie was pulled up, his hands buried deep in the front pocket, and he hadn't spoken much that day. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of someone who had run out of words, someone who knew that words wouldn't change a thing. The past few days had been an endless cycle of fear, fleeting hope, and exhaustion. Linda's oxygen levels had stabilized for the most part, but the damage from her time in the morgue loomed over them like a dark cloud. It was impossible to ignore. The doctors had been blunt but careful in their words, their expressions grave during every meeting. "Her brain activity is limited," one doctor had said just days before, his voice measured but heavy. "Only about 10% of her neurological functions seem intact." Gina had felt her heart shatter all over again. She remembered gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white, her nails digging into the wood, her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall, not in front of him, not now. "But what are you saying?" she had asked, her tone sharp like a blade. Her voice was laced with anger, daring him to say something she wouldn't accept. The doctor had glanced down at his clipboard, then back at her, his expression filled with the kind of sympathy that felt patronizing, the kind of look that said they'd already decided she should give up. "I'm saying it's unlikely she'll ever walk, speak, or recognize faces. It's a hard reality, Mrs. Harris, but I believe it's one you need to prepare for." "Prepare for?" Gina had snapped, her voice cracking as her rage boiled over. She pushed back her chair with such force that it screeched against the floor. "Prepare for what exactly? To give up on my child? To accept that she's less than whole just because you say so?" The doctor had tried to explain, but Gina didn't let him. "No, I'm not preparing for that. I'm preparing for her to live. That's all you need to worry about, keeping her alive. I'll handle the rest." Those words replayed in her mind now as she watched Linda's tiny chest rise and fall. Her fingers rested on the glass, trembling. Her lips parted as she whispered to herself, "You're wrong. You don't know my baby like I do. You're wrong." Her phone buzzed on the armrest beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. For a second she hesitated, half expecting more bad news, but when she picked it up, it was just a message from Malcolm. "How's she doing? Y'all good?" Gina typed back quickly, "She's stable, still breathing on her own." The words felt good to type. Breathing on her own. It wasn't much, but it was everything. She glanced over at Stephen, who was still sitting quietly with his head tilted back. She nudged him gently. She said. "Malcolm says hi," she said softly. Stephen opened one eye, giving her a faint, tired smile. "Tell him to bring real food next time," he muttered, his voice rough from exhaustion. Gina smiled back, the brief moment of humor lightening the heavy weight on her chest, if only for a moment. She sent Malcolm a follow-up text, "Bring real food, Stephen's tired of chips and soda." Malcolm replied almost immediately with a laughing emoji and on it. But the momentary reprieve was shattered in an instant. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor changed suddenly, the beeping becoming sharper and faster. Gina froze, her body going cold as her eyes darted to the screen. The numbers were dropping. 92, 93, 94. Her heart plummeted, and her breath caught in her throat. "No!" Gina whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no!" She shot up from her chair, her hands pressed against the glass as she stared at Linda. The color in her daughter's face began to shift from a soft brown to a pale gray. Her chest, once rising and falling steadily, slowed, then stopped. "Somebody help!" Gina screamed, her voice piercing the room like a knife. "Help her, please!" Nurses rushed into the room as alarms blared, their faces calm but focused. Stephen jolted upright, his eyes darting to Linda as panic gripped him. Gina's cries filled the room, her voice raw and desperate. "She's crashing," one nurse called out, "heart rate plummeting, oxygen saturation critical." "Prepare for resuscitation," shouted another. Gina felt the world collapse around her as chaos erupted. Her knees buckled and Stephen caught her just before she hit the floor. She clung to his shirt, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please," she choked out, "please don't take her from me again." The beeping of the monitors quickened, the noise stabbing into her chest like daggers. Her vision blurred with tears, but she refused to look away. All she could do was pray, hold on, and wait for the fight to continue. Nurses burst into the room, their faces tight with focus, moving with the urgency of those who knew every second counted. The beeping of the alarm grew louder, faster, more frantic. Gina stumbled back, her hands pressed tightly to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror as she watched her baby fighting for life yet again. "She's crashing! Do something!" she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "Bagger!" shouted a nurse, and another immediately grabbed a small bag valve mask, pressing it over Linda's tiny face. The nurse began squeezing it in a rhythmic pattern, forcing oxygen into her daughter's fragile lungs. Moments later, the doctor stormed into the room, his eyes sharp, his jaw clenched with determination. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice slicing through the chaos. "Saturation's dropping fast. Cardiac arrest is possible," a nurse called out, her hands deftly adjusting the oxygen supply. "Prepare for compressions," the doctor ordered, his tone steady, despite the storm in the room. Gina's back hit the wall as she slid down, her legs giving out beneath her. Her entire body felt like it was encased in ice, numb, frozen. She couldn't process what was happening. All she could do was watch, helpless, as the nurses worked on Linda's still body. Tears spilled down her cheeks as a soft whisper escaped her trembling lips. "Please, please don't take her from me again." Her voice cracked like shattered glass and her knees gave way completely. She sank to the cold, sterile floor, her eyes locked on her daughter's lifeless form. Her breath came in shallow gasps, as if the very air in the room was suffocating her. "Charging paddles," one of the nurses announced, rolling a small defibrillator to Linda's side. The doctor placed the tiny pediatric pads onto Linda's chest, his hands steady and precise. "Clear," he barked, his voice loud and firm. The room fell silent for a heartbeat as the defibrillator delivered its shock. Linda's small body jolted violently, the force of the electricity causing her limbs to jerk. Gina flinched, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she pressed them harder against her mouth. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the image of her daughter's tiny frame convulsing burned into her mind. "Still no pulse," a nurse called out, her voice laced with urgency. "Charging again, 30 joules," the doctor commanded. "Here." The second jolt came, Linda's body arching slightly on the table before falling still once more. Gina held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that she thought it might shatter. The monitors remained silent for a moment, the absence of sound heavier than any scream. But then, faint and rhythmic, came the sound she had been desperate to hear. Beshens. Beep beep beep. The nurse's voice broke through the tense silence. She's back. We've got a pulse. Steady rhythm. Gina's entire body sagged, the weight of her fear finally releasing in a flood of tears. She crumpled completely to the floor, her sobs breaking free from her chest in heaving waves. Stephen dropped to his knees beside her, his strong arms wrapping around her as she shook uncontrollably in his embrace. "I can't do this anymore," she wept into his chest, her voice raw and broken. "I can't lose her again. I won't survive it." Stephen's own tears streamed down his face as he held her tighter. "You're not going to lose her," he whispered, his voice cracking under the strain of his emotions. "She's a fighter, Gina, just like you. She's not giving up." For hours after the ordeal, Gina refused to leave Linda's side. She didn't sleep, she didn't eat. She sat in the same chair, her hands pressed to the incubator, her eyes locked on her daughter as if her sheer will alone could keep her alive. Nurses came and went, checking Linda's vitals and offering food and water to Gina, but she refused them all. She was terrified that if she looked away, if she even blinked, something would go wrong. When the doctor finally returned, he pulled up a chair beside Gina, his face lined with exhaustion and concern. "We need to talk about her prognosis," he began gently, his tone cautious but firm. "Her brain scans show signs of severe oxygen deprivation. There's a significant chance of long-term developmental issues, cognitive delays, motor function loss. It's something we need to prepare for." Gina didn't flinch. Her eyes never left Linda as the doctor spoke. "I'm not preparing for anything but life," she said firmly, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I'm not giving up on her, and I don't want you to give up on her either." The doctor nodded slowly, his expression softening as he saw the fire in her eyes. "Then we'll keep fighting," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to be ready for the possibility that things might not—" "They never were," Gina interrupted, her gaze as sharp as her tone. "Things were never normal, but she's still here, and that's all that matters. If there was a solution—" Her voice softened as she leaned closer to the incubator, her fingers brushing gently against the glass. "You hear me, baby girl? You're still here. You're still fighting, so I'm not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." For a moment Gina thought she saw something, just the faintest twitch of Linda's tiny fingers. Her breath caught as her heart swelled with a fierce, unshakable determination. "That's it, baby girl," she whispered, her voice trembling with love. "You keep fighting because I'm right here, fighting with you." The weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on Gina's shoulders, but she refused to let it crush her. This fight wasn't over, not for her, not for Linda. She would stay by her daughter's side through every moment, no matter how hard it got. Linda's tiny chest rose and fell steadily, each fragile breath like a whispered reminder that she was still here, still fighting. Her small body was connected to machines that beeped and whirred with mechanical precision. Tubes ran from her nose, arms, and legs, keeping her tethered to life. Her soft brown face remained calm, her eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep, but Gina knew better. Every breath Linda took was a battle, every twitch of her tiny fingers was a war won. Stephen sat beside Gina, his hands clasped together as he leaned forward, his focus glued to Linda. His hoodie was rumpled, his jeans stained from spilled coffee, and his beard was scruffy from days without shaving. He looked just as worn as Gina felt, but neither of them had left Linda's side since the last time her heart had stopped. The fear of leaving, of not being there if something went wrong, kept them rooted in place. "Her vitals are holding steady," Nurse Danielle said softly as she entered the room. Her voice was calm and professional, but there was warmth in her tone. She moved toward Linda's incubator with practiced care, checking the heart monitor, adjusting the oxygen flow, and scribbling notes on her clipboard. "It's doing better than expected, Gina. We're not out of the woods, but it's progress." Gina sat up straighter, her hands gripping the edge of the incubator. "Better isn't enough," she muttered, her voice rough from exhaustion and endless worry, her eyes sharp and unyielding flicked to Danielle. "Better can turn into worse in a heartbeat. I need her to be safe. I need her to be okay. I need more than better." Danielle's expression softened, though her smile carried a weight of understanding. I know, she said gently, but you're doing everything you can, and so is she. Your baby girl is stronger than anyone here. Danielle adjusted the oxygen tube running to Linda's nose, her fingers delicate and deliberate. You should try to rest though, she added, glancing over at Gina. Even the strongest moms need rest. Gina didn't respond. Her jaw clenched and her gaze snapped back to Linda. Rest. How could she even think about resting when her daughter was in this fragile state? Rest could wait. Right now Linda needed her. Every moment, every breath counted. The hours dragged by, each one feeling longer than the last. Gina sat perfectly still, her fingers tapping lightly against the side of the incubator in a rhythmic pattern. Her mind was a storm, filled with fear, hope, and unanswered prayers. Every beep from the machines made her flinch, her eyes darting to the monitors, terrified she'd miss something. Her phone buzzed on the chair beside her, breaking her trance. She blinked and picked it up, her fingers trembling as she read the message. It was from Malcolm. How's she doing? Gina stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back with shaky fingers. Stable, still breathing on her own, taking it day by day. The reply came almost instantly. She's a warrior, just like her mama. For the first time in what felt like forever, Gina's lips twitched into the faintest smile. She glanced at Stephen, who was leaning forward, his head in his hands. Malcolm says she's a warrior, Gina said softly. Stephen lifted his head, his eyes red from sleepless nights but filled with a faint glimmer of hope. She is, he muttered, his gaze shifting to Linda. She definitely is. They sat in silence for a while after that, listening to the steady hum of the ventilator and the soft beeping of the monitors. The room was quiet, the air heavy with the delicate peace that hung by a thread, threatening to shatter at any moment. And then, without warning, it shattered. The heart monitor let out a sharp, jarring beep, followed by another, faster this time. The rhythm was erratic, frantic. The beeping grew louder and Gina's heart plummeted. Her body stiffened as her eyes shot to the screen. The numbers were dropping. Oxygen saturation 85, 78, 62. Her chest tightened and her pulse thundered in her ears. She bolted from her chair, her legs shaky but driven by pure instinct. Stephen, she gasped, her voice rising in panic. Look at the monitor. Stephen's head snapped up, his face paling as he saw the flashing red numbers. Somebody help, Gina screamed, her voice raw and desperate. Help her, she's crashing. The door burst open as nurses flooded into the room, their faces masks of calm urgency. Danielle was already at Linda's side, her hands moving with practiced precision. Suction airway, intubation kit now, Danielle barked, her tone sharp and commanding. Gina stumbled back, gripping the edge of the incubator so tightly that her fingers ached. Tears streamed down her face as her body trembled uncontrollably. Please, she sobbed, her voice cracking. Please don't do this. Not again, not my baby, please. Stephen stood frozen for a moment, his hands buried in his hair, before he rushed to Gina's side. He wrapped an arm around her, his voice shaking as he tried to calm her. They're doing everything they can, Gina. She's going to fight. She's not giving up, remember? But Gina barely heard him. Her entire world was the sight of Linda's tiny body lying still, surrounded by a flurry of hands and machines. The nurse inserted a small tube into Linda's throat as the ventilator worked harder to stabilize her breathing. Danielle's voice cut through the chaos. Clear the airway, keep her oxygen levels up. For a moment, Gina thought she might pass out. Her legs felt weak, her vision blurred from tears, and her heart ached with the weight of fear. Then suddenly, the beeping on the heart monitor slowed. The wild, frantic rhythm steadied. The oxygen saturation numbers began to climb. 72, 85, 93. Danielle let out a breath, relief flooding her face. She's stabilizing, she said, her voice calm but firm. We've got her. Gina collapsed into Stephen's arms, her body shaking with sobs of relief. She clung to him, her face buried in his chest as the tears flowed freely. Thank you, she whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible. Thank you, God. Stephen held her close, his own tears falling silently. They stayed that way for what felt like an eternity, the hum of the machines now a soothing rhythm instead of a warning. Gina turned back to Linda, her voice soft but full of fierce determination. You're still here, baby girl, she whispered, pressing her hand against the incubator. You're still fighting, and I'm still here right beside you. Steven stood behind Gina, his hands gripping her shoulders, but she barely registered his touch. Her world had shrunk to the size of the incubator, her focus locked on Linda. Her baby girl's soft brown skin was growing pale, her tiny lips taking on a faint bluish hue that sent ice through Gina's veins. "Intubate now!" Nurse Danielle barked, her tone sharp and unwavering as she worked swiftly. She gently inserted a breathing tube into Linda's throat, her gloved hands moving with practiced precision. The ventilator hissed, forcing air into Linda's fragile lungs. Gina's knees buckled, her legs refusing to hold her weight under the crushing weight of fear. Steven caught her just before she collapsed, pulling her into his chest. Her sobs racked her body as her hands clung to his shirt, gripping it like a lifeline. "Gina, please, God," she choked out, her voice raw and trembling. "Don't take her from me. Not again. Please, God. Please." Her head fell against Steven's chest as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her as tightly as he could, as if his strength could shield her from the unbearable pain. The sound of the heart monitor filled the room, each beat like a countdown, slicing through her already shattered heart. And then it came. The long, piercing, unbroken beat. Gina's head shot up, her breath catching in her throat. The heart monitor showed a flat line. Her heart stopped, her body frozen in disbelief as the world around her blurred. "No!" she screamed, breaking free from Steven's hold. She lunged forward, slamming her hands against the glass of the incubator. "No! You get her back! You get her back right now!" Her voice was wild, desperate, and filled with raw, unrelenting rage. "Do not let my baby die! Do you hear me?" Danielle's voice was firm and steady, cutting through the chaos. "Charging to 30 joules, she announced, the defibrillator in her hands. She pressed the small pediatric pads to Linda's chest. The jolt sent Linda's tiny body arching slightly on the table, her arms flinching upward. Gina squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch, but the image of her daughter's fragile body convulsing burned in her mind. "Again," Danielle commanded. Her voice never wavered, though her face showed the strain of the moment. "Charging to 50 joules. Clear?" The second shock hit. Linda's body jolted again. The silence was deafening. Gina's nails dug into the glass of the incubator, her breath held in her chest, and then, like a miracle, the sound came. The soft, steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the room once more. Gina's legs gave out completely and she crumpled to the floor, her body trembling as uncontrollable sobs poured from her. Steven dropped to his knees beside her, his arms wrapping around her as tears streamed down his own face. "She's back," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She's back, Gina. She's still here." Gina lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes locking on Linda. Her baby girl's chest rose and fell once again, slowly but steadily. The bluish hue had faded from her lips, replaced with a faint warmth. "You did it, baby girl," Gina whispered, her voice trembling as she pressed her forehead against the glass of the incubator. Tears streamed down her cheeks as relief flooded her entire being. "You did it! You're so strong! You're so strong, baby! Mommy's so proud of you!" Her voice softened, filled with love and fierce determination. "I'm never leaving you, Linda," she whispered, her breath fogging up the glass. "Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever." End of preface. She placed her palm flat against the glass, her eyes fixed on Linda's chest as it rose and fell, each breath a small victorious battle, each breath a promise of life. "You hear me, baby girl?" Gina whispered, her voice strong despite the tears that still flowed freely. "We're not done fighting. Not yet. Not ever." Linda's hand rested on her shoulder, and she turned to him. They shared a look that said more than words ever could, a shared vow, unspoken but deeply understood. They would never stop fighting for Linda, not for a second. The room was quiet now, the chaos subsiding into a fragile calm. The steady hum of the ventilator and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor were the only sounds, but to Gina they were the most beautiful sounds in the world. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, her heart swelling with gratitude, hope, and love. Her baby was still here, still fighting. What a powerful story of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.